My parents wrote a check for $214,000 for my sister's education. I know the exact number because I found the receipt. Years later, Heber, tucked inside a manila folder in my mother's filing cabinet, the kind of folder labeled with nothing, which is how I've learned people label the things they most want to disappear. When it was my turn, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table, folded her hands the way she did when she'd already made a decision, and said, "Nadia, you're resourceful. You'll figure it out." I was 17, Eben. I did not yet know that resourceful was the word certain parents use when they mean you're on your own. Gifin. What I didn't know, what nobody told me until my grandmother was gone, and her attorney read a second will that none of us knew existed, was that my parents had never been free to choose equally between us, them, that the inequality I had absorbed as personal, as a verdict on my worth, had a financial architecture underneath it, a structure, a contract, and that someone in my family had built that structure deliberately, decades before I was born. Stay with me. This story takes time to tell properly, and I think it's worth telling properly. Subscribe if you're new, and if you've ever sat across from a parent who looked at you like you were asking for too much, this one is for you. My name is Nadia. I'm 34 years old. Iba. I'm a financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm in Chicago, which is either ironic or completely inevitable, depending on how you look at it. Ibid. I spend my days reading the structure beneath numbers, finding what the surface obscures. It turns out the skill is transferable. I grew up in a comfortable suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. My father is a civil engineer. My mother spent most of my childhood doing part-time bookkeeping and, as she described it, managing the household. We had a 4-bedroom colonial, 2 cars, a yard with a Japanese maple. My father pruned every October, like it was a personal responsibility to the tree itself. We were, by any reasonable measure, a family with options. My sister's name is Danielle. She is 3 years older than me. Blonde where I am dark, extroverted where I am precise. Growing up, people responded to Danielle the way people respond to weather. They oriented themselves around her. My parents were no different. My father laughed more freely around her. My mother planned further into the future for her. Danielle was the destination. I was, it often seemed, the road. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it the way I've learned to say most things from my childhood. As a matter of record, the pattern started early, and I cataloged it, the way children catalog things they don't yet have language for, through feeling first, understanding later. When Danielle was in 7th grade, she wanted to take private tennis lessons. Hipney. My parents enrolled her at a club 40 minutes away. 3 days a week, my mother drove her there and waited. When I expressed interest in the same lessons 2 years later, my mother said we'd look into it. We never did. I joined the school team instead and paid for my own rackets with babysitting money. I was 12 when Danielle needed a car for her senior year of high school. My parents bought her a used but reliable Volkswagen Jetta, clean, safe, under 50,000 miles. When I reached my senior year, my father told me I should start looking at the bus schedule and learn to be independent. He said it with the warmth of a man who believed he was giving me something. I took the bus for 2 years without complaint. I was building something in silence. A private record of the gap between what she received and what I received, and the explanations offered for it. And the way those explanations never quite held up under examination. The explanations were always reasonable on their face. Timing, they said. Circumstances. Danielle had a particular need, a particular opportunity. It wasn't that they loved her more. Of course not. It was just that this situation required this resource. And that situation required patience. I was always the situation that required patience. The college conversation is the one I return to most, even now. It happened in phases. The first phase was the campus visits. My parents took Danielle on 11 college tours over the course of her junior and senior year of high school. I know it was 11 because Danielle posted about each one, Keep and I, was the kind of younger sister who kept count without admitting I was keeping count. They flew to Boston twice. They drove to Philadelphia, Keepy. They spent a weekend in New York, that my mother still references as one of her favorite trips. When my junior year arrived, my mother told me that campus visits were really something you should take initiative on, even the. She handed me a brochure for a state school for 40 minutes away and said the campus was beautiful and I should consider it. I had a 4.1 GPA. I had scored in the 94th percentile on my SATs. I had been editor of the school literary magazine for 2 years. I am not telling you this to establish that I was exceptional, Giebel. I am telling you this because I was not, by any academic measure, a child who warranted less investment. And I knew it. And knowing it made the gap harder, not easier, to hold. I applied to 14 schools on my own, Heathney. I researched them on my own. I requested fee waivers when I needed them, and didn't tell my parents because I already understood, instinctively, that asking for things placed me in a position I didn't want to occupy. I was accepted to 3 universities with strong programs. One offered me a partial scholarship. I called my mother to tell her, and there was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that means someone is choosing their words, and she said, "That's wonderful, Nadia. See? Resourceful." I enrolled. I took out loans. Senior. I worked 22 hours a week at an off-campus cafe, with a floor that was always slightly sticky, and a manager who scheduled me for closing shifts on exam weeks. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in economics, Gearington, $17,000 in debt, and a resentment I had packed so tightly I could almost convince myself it wasn't there. Danielle graduated from Cornell the same spring. My parents threw her a party at the house. 40 people, catered. My mother wore a dress I had never seen before, either. I drove home from my own graduation alone and stopped at a Wendy's on the way because I hadn't eaten since morning, and I didn't want to ask anyone for anything. For several years after college, I told myself I had released it. This is what people who carry things often tell themselves. I'm over it. I've processed it. I understand people are complicated and parents do the best they can, and I turned out fine, didn't I? I turned out fine. I built a career. I moved to Chicago. I maintained a functional relationship with my family, holiday visits, Sunday phone calls with my mother, occasional dinners with Danielle, who had married well and lived in Westchester, and had a kitchen island I could fit my entire first apartment inside. I told myself that the past was the past, and that I had chosen not to let it define me. What I had actually done is what I now recognize as financial analyst thinking applied to emotional life. I had moved the liability off the active ledger and into a long-term account I wasn't looking at directly. The debt was still there. I had just stopped checking the balance. My grandmother's name was Rosalind. Everyone called her Roz. She was my mother's mother, 79 years old, sharp until she wasn't, the kind of woman who kept a crossword dictionary, alphabetized on her nightstand, and corrected the grammar of greeting cards. She had been a bookkeeper for 40 years before retiring. Numbers were her native language, which is something I think about often now. I loved her plainly, Giebel. She was one of the few members of my family with whom I felt no need to perform. She asked me questions and waited for the full answer. When I was in college, she sent me checks. Small ones, $50 here, $100 at Christmas, with notes that said things like "for something that isn't the cafe." She knew about the cafe. I hadn't told her. She had simply noticed, the way precise people notice. She died in November of my 32nd year. It was expected. Her health had been declining for 18 months, but expected loss is still loss, and I grieved her with a fullness I hadn't anticipated. The estate proceedings began in January. My mother had power of attorney. She had been managing my grandmother's affairs for the last 2 years of her life, handling accounts, coordinating care, processing the practical machinery of a life winding down. She managed it with competence and, I believed, with love. In February, we gathered in the office of my grandmother's attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handled my grandmother's legal affairs for over a decade. My mother sat at one end of the table. Danielle sat beside her. I sat across from them. Patricia distributed copies of the will my mother had helped prepare 4 years prior, the one we all understood to be the governing document. It left the estate divided primarily between my mother and her brother, my uncle Gerald, with modest bequests to Danielle and me. Straightforward, expected. Patricia paused. She opened a second folder. Rosalind executed a codicil, she said, 18 months ago, without notifying any family members. She was explicit in her instruction that it be disclosed at the reading, and not before. I watched my mother's face change, not dramatically. A small shift, the kind you only catch if you've spent years learning to read a person's control. She was also explicit, Patricia continued, about the reason. She was my mother's mother, 79 years old, sharp until she wasn't, the kind of woman who kept a crossword dictionary, alphabetized on her nightstand, and corrected the grammar of greeting cards. She had been a bookkeeper for 40 years before retiring. Numbers were her native language, which is something I think about often now. I loved her plainly, Ebel. She was one of the few members of my family with whom I felt no need to perform. She asked me questions and waited for the full answer. When I was in college, she sent me checks. Small ones, $50 here, $100 at Christmas, with notes that said things like for something that isn't the cafe. She knew about the cafe. I hadn't told her. She had simply noticed, the way precise people notice. She died in November of my 32nd year. It was expected. Her health had been declining for 18 months, but expected loss is still loss, and I grieved her with a fullness I hadn't anticipated. The estate proceedings began in January. My mother had power of attorney. She had been managing my grandmother's affairs for the last 2 years of her life, handling accounts, coordinating care, processing the practical machinery of a life winding down. She managed it with competence and, I believed, with love. In February, we gathered in the office of my grandmother's attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handled my grandmother's legal affairs for over a decade. My mother sat at one end of the table. Danielle sat beside her. I sat across from them. Patricia distributed copies of the will my mother had helped prepare 4 years prior, the one we all understood to be the governing document. It left the estate divided primarily between my mother and her brother, my uncle Gerald, with modest bequests to Danielle and me. Straightforward, expected. Patricia paused. She opened a second folder. Rosalind executed a codicil, she said, 18 months ago, without notifying any family members. She was explicit in her instruction that it be disclosed at the reading, and not before. I watched my mother's face change, not dramatically. A small shift, the kind you only catch if you've spent years learning to read a person's control. She was also explicit, Patricia continued, about the reason. The codicil amended the distribution of my grandmother's investment portfolio. Approximately $340,000. That had previously been split equally between my mother and uncle. Under the amendment, $60,000 was redirected. To me, directly. Named specifically, with language my grandmother had apparently composed herself because it didn't sound like attorney language, either. It sounded like Roz. To my granddaughter Nadia, who has never once asked me for what she deserved. This is long overdue. Patricia set down the document and let the room hold that for a moment. Then she said, there is also an explanatory letter. Rosalind asked that it be read aloud. My mother said, Patricia, I don't think that's. It was her instruction, Patricia said, gently but without movement. My mother pressed her lips together and looked at the table. Patricia read, I am going to tell you what was in that letter. But I want to first tell you what it felt like to sit in that room while it was being read. Me. Because the feeling preceded the information, and I think the feeling matters. It felt like being seen for the first time by someone who was no longer there to see me. It felt like a hand reaching across an absence, very deliberately, with paperwork. My grandmother had written the letter over the course of 3 weeks, she said. She had drafted it 4 times. She wanted to be accurate. Numbers mattered to her. So did words, Healy. When words were doing work that mattered. She began with a fact. For 11 years, my parents had received a private, recurring financial contribution from her. $5,000 per year, transferred quarterly, beginning when Danielle entered middle school and continuing through Danielle's graduation from Cornell. In total, $55,000, yearly. The transfers had been structured as gifts to avoid reporting requirements and had never been disclosed to me, or, as far as she could determine, to anyone outside the immediate transaction, EB. She had authorized those transfers. She made that clear. She did not blame my parents for accepting them. But she had spent the last years of her life sitting with what those transfers had funded and what they had, in their asymmetry, communicated. She had enabled a structure, she wrote, that told one granddaughter she was worth an extraordinary investment, and told the other to be resourceful. She had agreed to that structure because my mother had presented it as necessary. Danielle's path, my mother had argued, required particular resources at particular moments, and Nadia was so capable, so independent, she would find her way. And Roz had believed it, or had allowed herself to believe it, which she acknowledged was not the same thing. I watched Nadia work her way through college, she wrote, and I sent her $50 and told myself it was enough. It was not enough. I knew it was not enough. I chose comfort over honesty for too long, Eva. And I am correcting it now because I am 81 years old, and I have run out of reasons to wait. She ended the letter with a line I have memorized, and will carry the rest of my life, Eva. The difference between what I gave and what I enabled others to withhold is not a number I can fully repay. This is a beginning. I hope she knows the rest was always hers. The room was very quiet. Table. Danielle was looking at the table. She had gone the particular pale of someone absorbing a piece of information that restructures several prior assumptions simultaneously. My mother was looking at me, Cuban. Her expression was not guilty, exactly. It was the expression of someone who has carried a thing for a long time and has now been relieved of it against her will, and does not yet know if she feels lighter or exposed. I was doing what I do. I was organizing, building the structure of it, placing the facts in relation to each other and watching the shape form. $55,000. 11 years. Quarterly transfers. Structured to avoid disclosure. Cornell tuition, room and board, study abroad, the graduation party with 40 people, and a catered spread, and my mother in a dress I had never seen. A sticky floor, and a closing shift, and a Wendy's on the way home from my own graduation. These were not random outcomes. They were funded outcomes. Someone had made line items out of our childhoods, and the line items were not equal, and now I had the spreadsheet. I did not speak in the attorney's office. I signed what needed to be signed. I accepted a copy of the letter. Patricia handed it to me specifically, with both hands, as if it had weight. And I put it in my bag, and I walked to my car, and I sat in the parking structure for 45 minutes before I drove anywhere. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think honesty in these moments is the only thing worth offering. I felt vindicated. There is no cleaner word for it, and I won't dress it up. 17 years of telling myself I had imagined the disparity, or exaggerated it, or failed to account for some reasonable explanation. And here was the reasonable explanation. And it was $55,000, and it had been hidden. I had not been paranoid. I had been observant. I also felt grief that arrived in a form I wasn't prepared for. Grief for my grandmother, but more specifically grief for the version of our relationship that might have existed if she had said any of this while she was alive. If she had made one phone call. If she had said, once, in a kitchen or on a Sunday afternoon, I see what's happening and I don't think it's right. She loved me, I have no doubt of that. But she had also been complicit. And the love and the complicity existed together, Eben, and I had to hold both. My mother called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened to the message, which was 40 seconds long, and said almost nothing. She was sorry. She wanted to explain. She hoped I would call her back. I sat with the message for 3 days before I called. When I did, I gave her the space to speak first. Hebe. Because I am a person who has learned that information gathered before judgment offered is usually more useful. She said several things. Some of them were explanations. Some of them were, I think, sincere. Eva. She said she had always believed I was capable in ways Danielle wasn't, which she intended as a compliment, and which landed, predictably, as its opposite. She said she had never thought of it as taking from me. She had thought of it as giving to Danielle. I told her that the distinction, from where I had stood, was not visible. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Your grandmother always had a complicated way of being right, Efi." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. We talked for another few minutes about logistics, the estate timeline, some paperwork. Then we said goodbye in the way we always do, which is affectionate. And slightly careful, the way you embrace something fragile. Danielle texted me 2 weeks later. It was a long text, the kind composed over multiple drafts, with careful paragraph breaks. She said she hadn't known about the transfers. She said she was sorry, She said she'd always known something was off, but had told herself. And here I recognized my own old language in her words. That she was probably imagining it. I believed her, Eben. Danielle benefited from a structure she hadn't designed. That is different from designing it, Ibda. I have spent enough time in finance to understand that the person who profits from an arrangement and the person who architects it are not always the SARS person, and conflating them is neither accurate nor useful. I wrote back. I told her I believed her. I told her we should have dinner sometime, just us, without the particular performance our family dinners tend to require. We did, eventually, Ether. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. It went until midnight. I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly, Hebe. But the particular sensation of a door opening in a room I thought was sealed. I want to tell you what I've done with this, because I think that's the part of these stories people most need. Hebe. I accepted the $60,000. I put $20,000 toward the last of my student loan balance, the loan I'd carried for 12 years. Hebe. A number I'd grown so accustomed to seeing that I'd almost stopped registering it as a wound. The remaining $40,000 I invested in an index fund, which my grandmother would have approved of. Being a woman who believed in compound interest as a philosophy as much as a mechanism, I am not dramatically different financially. $60,000 in your 30s, after loans and a city and a career built from scratch, is meaningful but not transformative. What it is, more than the number, is a correction in the record. Roz put it in the record. I find that I needed it in the record, in a way I hadn't fully understood until it was there. As for my parents, we are in the slow, imprecise work of reconstruction. My mother and I have had 3 conversations that I would describe as genuinely honest, which is 3 more than we had in the 32 years before Patricia Chen read that letter aloud. She has not apologized in the way I might have written an apology if I were scripting it, but she has said things that suggest an interior reckoning. Small admissions, phrased carefully, offered with the hesitancy of a person who is unused to accountability and is attempting it anyway. I am choosing to treat those offerings as meaningful, because the alternative is to require a confession perfectly worded, and I have seen enough of human nature to know that perfectly worded confessions are rare and usually insincere, and imperfect ones offered with difficulty are often the truest version available. My father has said very little. This does not surprise me. My father is a man who loves through action. He drove me to soccer practice. He fixed things in my apartments. He showed up. He loved me through presence. Ibtha. The conversation he hasn't had with me may never happen, and I have decided that I will not measure his love by its absence any longer. He is 71 years old, and he is, I think, genuinely confused by the territory we're in. I extend him something I would not have extended 2 years ago. I extend him patience, not the patience of a person who expects nothing, he will be, but the patience of a person who has decided that being owed something and demanding payment in a specific currency are different choices, and I have enough now to make a different choice. Keen. Here is the thing about growing up as the one who was told to be resourceful. You become resourceful, genuinely. Not the resourcefulness of someone who had no other option, but the kind that becomes structural. It becomes how you think, how you plan, how you solve. I built a career on it. I built a life on it. I am not, at this point in my story, asking you to pity me or to celebrate me, Ina. I am asking you to see what it costs. It costs you the ease of not wondering. It costs you the particular confidence that comes from being chosen without having to prove yourself first. It costs you the small freedoms of a person who has been told, repeatedly and in tangible ways, that their needs are worth meeting in full. Those are real costs. They shaped me in real ways. And knowing the reason, having the spreadsheet, holding the letter, doesn't unshape me. It doesn't reimburse the years spent at the cafe, or the 3 days I sometimes couldn't afford groceries and didn't tell anyone. It doesn't give back the graduation day. What it gives me is the end of the question why, and the end of the corollary question, the quieter one, the one I had lived inside for so long I'd stopped noticing its walls. What is wrong with me? Nothing was wrong with me. There was a spreadsheet, there were quarterly transfers. There was a grandmother with a crossword dictionary on her nightstand who waited too long and then did not wait any longer. And there was a second will. My grandmother's letter lives in the top drawer of my desk. I don't read it often, but I know it's there, which is its own kind of thing. The knowledge that somewhere, in document form, someone looked at what happened and called it by its name. That is what she left me, beyond the $60,000. A piece of paper that said, "I see you, I saw it, it was real." Some people never get that. I am aware of how fortunate I am, in the strange economy of family truths, to have received it at all, even late, even in a room with a table between me and my mother, from a woman who was no longer there. Late is not the same as never. I keep her letter as evidence, not of grievance, but of record. Proof that the arithmetic I ran in my head for 2 decades was correct, that the numbers added up to exactly what I thought they added up to. I was always going to be fine. I was made resourceful, and resourceful people find their way. But I should not have had to, and now I know it, even. If this story reached something in you, if you have your own bus pass, your own sticky cafe floor, your own collection of reasonable explanations that never quite added up, then you already know what I'm going to say, even. You were not imagining it. You may never get a second will. You may never get a Patricia Chen reading a letter with both hands across a conference table. The accounting may never be made public, either. The structure may never be named, and you may spend your whole life with the arithmetic, but not the receipt. But your arithmetic was correct. That's dispersed if you're new. Share this with someone who has been told to be resourceful when what they deserved was to be chosen. And leave a comment. I read everyone. And some of them have told me things that reminded me, all over again, that I am not the only one who kept count.